Hello again, it's your old friend Theta, the monotone messiah. Part of what makes competition so fascinating is that it allows us to figure out who, amongst the people who choose to play, is the best. There's an explicit hierarchy based on an ability to win matches, and those who can do it most consistently end up on top. As such, one of the prime goals of any quality competitor is to break the game down to its very essence and develop, through experience and feedback, into a highly skilled player. What you're ultimately trying to do by going through this process is control whatever game environment you compete in. You want to get to a level of competence in which winning is as close to a sure thing as you can get. You could argue that competition is a way for us humans to feel like we have our hands on the levers of fate and get the rewards we deserve as a result. That's what makes winning so satisfying. For some portion of your life, you can feel like you've conquered entropy and become the master of your own destiny. Competitions enable this set of feelings through contests of relative skill. In almost all competitive settings, you compete against people who are supposed to be roughly near you in skill. If you can prove that you're better than them, you move up the rankings. And as you move up the rankings, you demonstrate that you have what could be considered absolute skill. In other words, what matters when you're competing is usually not whether you're the absolute best. What matters is that you're better or worse than your current opponent. Moving up the ranks is a sign that the gap between you and your previous opponents was large enough to justify new, stronger competition. It's only when you are in the upper echelons of the ranking system that you can start to say you have a high degree of absolute skill. But something odd and unexpected happens once you reach those upper echelons. The skill gaps get so small that they practically vanish. It's a challenge to look at either side of the match and declare that one is objectively superior. When the situation pops up, a paradox starts to take shape. When both sides have high absolute skill and there's a small or non-existent gap between them, luck becomes increasingly important. This goes against our intuitions, not to mention our expectations as competitors. We always want to believe that we've won because we were the better player, not because some form of randomness tilted the match in our favor. But as I've talked about before in my video on mistakes, when players with very high absolute skill face off against each other, it's often the errors or other chance moments that determine who wins or loses. Before going too far down this rabbit hole, I need to qualify what I'm about to say. There are some games out there where skill is the single dominant factor. Winners of two-player linear games with clear chains of causality, like chess, are won by those who make the best moves. Basically, whoever makes mistakes and gets exploited will lose, and whoever can identify and exploit those mistakes will win. Winning more in games like chess comes down to learning about increasingly complex chains of cause and effect, and improving your decision-making within those chains. This is why it makes sense to create a system like the ELO rating system, which is how player rank is determined in the world of chess. I know that if I were to sit down for a chess match against Garry Kasparov, I'm going to lose. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There just aren't that many situations in chess where luck plays a role. On the other end of the spectrum are games where luck is the only factor at play. Most casino games like roulette or craps fall into this category. When the roulette ball is thrown into the wheel, there isn't any way for players to influence the outcome. Hence, there isn't any skill involved. If you look at a large data set of roulette outcomes, you should expect to see a random distribution. But there are plenty of games that don't fall into either of those extremes of only luck or skill. More often than not, there is some element of chance that can potentially tip the scales in one way or another, mixed in with relative skill advantages. Take poker, for example. If you sit down with someone like Phil Ivey or Tom DeWan, who are seasoned professionals with big title wins, there's a good chance they'll beat you out of all your money. There's also a good chance that you'll beat them in any given hand by virtue of the randomness built into the game. As time goes on, their skill will eventually overtake yours. You should expect that over an extended period of time, they will walk away with your money. They understand the game and how to play it at a much deeper level, and that understanding is rightly classified as skill. In the short term, however, it wouldn't even be surprising if you beat them in a few hands. That's because the cards get shuffled before every hand, and the distribution of those cards isn't driven or influenced by anyone's playing ability. Instead, the distribution of the cards themselves is guided by the laws of probability, which means there's luck involved. They may know how to play whatever cards they get at a world-class level, but the swings of luck built into poker mean that even the best players will lose many hands in the near term. This is referred to as variance, which is itself a term that describes the variety of different outcomes you should expect. High variance means there's a wide variety of outcomes, and low variance means there's a low variety of outcomes. While I don't want to get into the specifics about variance here, the key idea to internalize is that variance means you can play correctly in a given context and still lose. It's only when you have a large enough sample of playtime that you can see whether you're skilled or not. In other words, when variance plays a big role in a game, it means you have to play a lot before you start to get useful information about whether you're good or bad. This is a trap a lot of poker players fall into, as they have a good night and think they're quality players. But if they aren't actually good, then their lack of skill will eventually translate into long-term losses as time goes on, and variance rears its ugly head. This is why you tend to see roughly the same crowd of players in the finals of big poker tournaments, but even the absolute best players get knocked out early sometimes due to variance. With enough hands and enough tournaments, these people are long-term winners. They just don't control what happens in the near term. Most team games are like this to one degree or another as well. Because there are so many interacting players, it's easy for either good or bad luck to interfere with the result because there's just so much variance in outcome based on what each player is doing. All it takes is one person either under or overperforming in their given roles, and probability starts to interfere. For example, an American football offense might do everything right, and then the running back drops the ball in the backfield. At this point, the ball is bouncing around and the players find themselves living in the world of chance rather than skill. That one fumble might even be decisive enough to swing the score one way or another. Again, a minor error can change the game. You can translate all of this into most games, including modern first-person shooters. The first thing you need to look for is randomizing elements. In Onward, for example, there are spawn points that change depending on the map and the objective. While some maps don't have much or any randomness built into the spawn points, several do. Additionally, games with very low time to kill, or TTK, like Onward, tend to generate lots of luck-based scenarios. Because it only takes a shot or two to kill someone, even very good players can be punished if they make small mistakes in terms of their positioning, accuracy, and so on. This is why you'll see even top-notch players have swings in their performance from map to map. On one map, a good player could have a massively positive KDR, while on the next, they're deep in the red. It's only after playing with them for an extended period of time that you can evaluate their skill on both a relative and absolute basis. Again, this is because variance plays a role. It's especially hard to play well when you face new players in high variance games, because they do all sorts of things you don't expect. There's an old Mark Twain quote I keep in mind whenever I'm thinking about this. The best swordsman in the world doesn't need to fear the second best swordsman in the world. No, the person for him to be afraid of is some ignorant antagonist who has never held a sword in his hand before. He doesn't do the thing he ought to do, and so the expert isn't prepared for him. He does the thing he ought not to do, and often it catches the expert out and ends him on the spot. I can attest to this being true, as I often find myself getting killed by new players just because they pull the wackiest, most unexpected moves, and they catch me off guard. In some ways, it's educational, but in others, it's just an odd consequence of variance. Much of the time, I'm forced to just shrug my shoulders and write it off to randomness. If you're a new player, it's worth keeping this in mind. Even if you kill someone who is considered a better player, that one scenario isn't enough to prove anything. Because of the role of variance in all sorts of games, including Onward, you have to play hundreds or even thousands of rounds before you can start to say that you've gathered enough data to say you're good or that a set of tactics is effective. The primary reason you should think this way goes beyond just taking account of variance, though. It's the most constructive mindset you can maintain whenever you're learning any new complex skill or game. You should be asking yourself whether you're good or getting lucky, and at no point should you stop asking that. By making this part of your regular learning process, you'll stay honest with yourself and not let your short-term results inflate your ego. This is what is frustrating for many new players, as they have found some minor level of success using suboptimal tactics or strategies, only to have them backfire when it counts, They think they're making progress or innovating in the game, but they haven't gathered the requisite data or tested against quality competition to come to that conclusion. There's also some frustration that comes from the veterans of a game when it comes to randomness. People put time and energy into mastering competitive games when there are returns on experience. In other words, if you put in the hours, then that should translate into a competitive edge over newer players. Introducing randomness by default hurts this process, because experience and skill have less of an impact on outcomes. Newer players prefer randomness because it means they have a chance to beat those who are more experienced, while veterans prefer a decrease in randomness because it protects their edge over newer players. If you pay attention to any competitive scene that's worth anything, you'll see this push-pull dynamic all the time. Veterans almost universally hate seeing major changes to the games they play because it impacts their returns on experience. But randomization has the most devastating impact, and sometimes it can even drive veterans to give up a game altogether. Surviving a competitive game with a strong element of randomness means a constant race to adapt and hold on during swings of both good and bad luck. Some of us enjoy this process, but others prefer to have a permanent edge that can't be dulled by chance. From the player's perspective, this all tells you that you need to keep two principles in mind as you work to improve your play. Number 1, never expect that all of your successes are based on skill alone. And number 2, never expect that all of your losses are based on luck alone. Most outcomes, whether good or bad, have elements of both luck and skill. We're naturally biased towards seeing positive outcomes as driven by skill and negative outcomes as driven by luck. It's worth keeping in mind that it's pretty much always a mix of the two. Anyone who thinks all of their successes or failures are driven by a single factor is bound to be delusional. The challenge then is to figure out how to disentangle the two factors. How do you know which has played the more dominant role? This is a big, deep conversation that doesn't have a single answer, but I'll leave you with some rules of thumb you can chew on whenever you want to ponder this problem. First of all, you need to break down the kind of game you're playing and figure out whether the structure of the game lends itself to one or the other. If you're trying to get better at playing roulette, you should realize there is no such thing as getting better at roulette because it's driven exclusively by the laws of probability. Any game that revolves around such a dynamic is bound to be luck-based. On the other hand, if you're trying to get better at chess, then it's best to figure out where the flaws in your decision-making processes are and spend pretty much all of your time on that project. The same could be said for pretty much all two-player zero-sum games with clear chains of cause and effect. If your games of choice don't fall into either extreme, then you have a bit of a task ahead of you. You'll need to map out the randomizing elements and assign values to them. Figuring out which elements matter most is critical because that's your starting point for determining how much variance you should expect within a game. The next step is to ask yourself if it's possible to lose a game on purpose. In a chess match against a grandmaster, you can't just accidentally win. It would require an extreme lapse in judgment for that to happen, whereas in poker, it's perfectly normal to win even if you're a complete newbie. Again, if it's impossible to lose on purpose, then you can focus exclusively on your skill development. If it isn't, then you need to account for the impact of luck more than you might be comfortable with. After that, you should examine the competitive scene and see who ends up on top most of the time. One of the key giveaways that someone is skilled in a specific game is that they always end up at the top or near it. If you're good at something, you should be able to perform well over and over again, and this is a property often referred to as persistence. In games where chance plays an outsized or dominant role, you should expect to see a regularly rotating roster of champions that would indicate a lack of persistence. In Onward, for example, there have so far only been 2 teams to ever take a season championship. There's a group of teams that are always nearby, a cast of usual suspects, so to speak, in the top 10. It's safe to say that the teams in both of these categories are highly skilled because their skill has been shown to be persistent over time. Like I said before, it takes time to figure out who's good and who isn't. When you have multiple seasons with the same people on top, it's usually a safe bet to say those teams are the best teams in the game. The stability of their position in the competitive ladder also indicates a high role of skill because there is in fact persistence. Lastly, you need to evaluate the level of competition you're personally facing on a regular basis. When you're playing in the lower brackets of a competitive game, the skill gaps tend to determine who wins or loses. But as you move up, those gaps get smaller and smaller, and luck plays a larger and larger role in the outcome. If you're not seeing that trend, then there's a good chance you're playing a game that's based more on luck than skill. Or at the very least, that luck plays a significant role in the game, not necessarily that skill is irrelevant. Remember, most outcomes are a mix of skill and luck. Unless you're playing a game with little to no randomness, or only randomness, both will play a role. And that's true beyond just video games. Well, friends, that's all I've got for you today. I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to end it here. Until next time, this is Theta, signing off.